Have you ever wondered why a man seems most restless, most haunted, in the very moment a woman of power withdraws her presence? It is not the absence of her voice or her touch that torments him, but the sudden eruption of something long buried within his own psyche. A silence like this is not empty. It is an initiation. The withdrawal of a queen does not merely leave him lonely. It awakens his shadow, the hidden figure he has been avoiding all along. At first, he feels the sting like a physical wound. The body remembers the warmth of attention, the rhythm of affection, and when it vanishes, the nervous system panics, mistaking absence for danger. His chest tightens, his thoughts scatter, and an ancient script unfolds. The boy inside cries for the mother who once withheld or withdrew. This is not about the woman standing before him now. It is about every forgotten moment he begged to be seen and was denied. The queen's silence cracks the dam that has held these memories under the surface, and they flood his awareness, though he cannot name them. He only feels the ache. But deeper than ache is rage. Rage at the wound that was never spoken, rage at dependency, rage at her power to awaken it. His ego insists that she is cruel, manipulative, distant. He tells himself she is cold. Yet beneath this projection lies the truth. He is at war not with her, but with the disowned fragments of himself. Jung called this the shadow, and it lives in every man. When she withdraws, she acts like the forbidden mirror that finally forces him to see it. He hates her for it, even as he cannot stop circling back. And you, listening now, know this dynamic in your bones. Perhaps you have watched a man grow restless when you stop giving, when you pull your light back into your own throne. Suddenly, the one who took you for granted searches for you like an addict searching for his next dose. It is not because you vanished. It is because he has lost the illusion that your energy could cover the emptiness inside him. Your absence cuts deeper than presence, for it unmasks his dependence. The queen does not withdraw to punish. She withdraws because her sovereignty demands it. Yet her very act of stepping back becomes a ritual fire in which his shadow screams to be acknowledged. There is an ancient archetype at play here, the untouchable muse. She is radiant but untamed, close enough to inspire, distant enough to remain sovereign. When the muse withdraws, the man is cast into the labyrinth of his own psyche. Every step he takes in search of her is a step deeper into the corridors of his own unmet longing. And the more he resists, the louder the echoes become. This is why silence and distance can drive him closer to madness than words ever could. He does not only miss her, he collides with himself. Consider this, the crack in the mirror. At first, he thinks he sees her retreat as a flaw in her, a cold rejection. But in truth, it is the mirror of his psyche cracking open. The image he once held of himself as whole and self-sufficient shatters, revealing what was underneath all along. He cannot bear the broken reflection. He blames the queen, yet the fracture is his own. And in that fracture lies the seed of transformation, if only he dares to look. But here is the forbidden truth. Most men will not look. They will chase the queen instead, hoping to stitch the mirror back together with her presence. They will beg, manipulate, rage, bargain, anything to avoid standing alone before the crack, because to stand there requires the courage to admit, the emptiness I fear is mine. And yet the ones who can endure it find something extraordinary. They discover that the wound is not annihilation, it is initiation. The shadow, once faced, no longer rules them. The queen, then, is not merely a woman. She becomes the catalyst of his individuation. For you, the woman, this is both burden and power. You are not responsible for healing his shadow, nor should you collapse your sovereignty to soothe his fear. The more you remain rooted in your throne, the more you embody the archetype that forces him to choose, evolve or remain broken. Your silence, when authentic, is not a weapon but a crown. The forbidden psychology is this. Withdrawal awakens in him not just desire, but the haunting possibility of transformation. That is why he obsesses. That is why he resents. That is why he cannot let go. And yet the story is not finished. If silence awakens his shadow, what awakens the deeper archetype that lies beneath, the part of him that could meet the queen as an equal rather than as a beggar? The answer lies beyond shadow, in a secret terrain Jung hinted at but never fully revealed. The deeper terrain begins when the man realizes he is not only haunted by absence, but by the feminine image within himself that absence reveals. Jung named this the anima, the inner woman dwelling in his unconscious. Most men never meet her directly, they encounter her only through projection onto the women they love, desire, or resent. When the queen withdraws, her silence tears away the veil of projection. Suddenly, he is face to face not only with her distance, but with the estranged inner woman he has banished to the dark. And that encounter terrifies him more than any silence in the external world. At first, he does not understand. He thinks he craves her return, her voice, her warmth. But if you look closely, you see his hunger has a strange quality, almost mythic, as if he were starving for something beyond her alone. He is starving for his own lost soul. The anima has been waiting inside, patient yet restless, knocking from behind the locked door of his heart. He ignored her when he drowned himself in work, when he numbed himself with pleasure, when he silenced his own intuition. But the queen's withdrawal places the key back into his trembling hands. She does not open the door for him. She forces him to notice it exists. And this is where the spiral begins. A man who is blind to his anima becomes a man ruled by her shadow. She appears in his dreams as the seductress he cannot resist, or as the witch who tortures him, or as the abandoned maiden he must rescue at all costs. He walks through waking life haunted by these phantom figures, not realizing they are fragments of himself. The queen's silence magnifies the volume of these figures until he can no longer ignore them. He sees her absence, but beneath it lurks the specter of every rejected emotion, every silenced vulnerability, every tenderness he labeled as weakness. For the woman watching this unfold, it may seem cruel. His desperation escalates, his behaviors become unpredictable, his words cut between longing and accusation. You may feel as though your silence has provoked chaos. Yet understand, you are not the author of his storm, you are the storm's revealer. You did not create his shadow or his anima. You simply stopped carrying the weight of them on your shoulders. And when you withdrew, the fragile illusion shattered. He thought he was whole because you completed the circle for him. The moment you pulled away, the half-circle collapsed, and he fell into the abyss of his own incompleteness. This is where the myth of the descent into the underworld becomes more than a story. In ancient tales, heroes journey downward to retrieve a lost treasure, to face death, to meet the goddess in her terrifying form. Silence and absence thrust him into his underworld. He must descend. He must meet the goddess not as fantasy, not as projection, but as the dark anima who holds both his fear and his salvation. Only then can he rise again as more than a boy chasing his mother, more than a lover clutching at an idol. Only then can he stand before the queen not as beggar, but as king. The paradox is sharp. The more he resists the descent, the more obsessed he becomes with the woman outside. He begs her to speak, to soothe, to return. Yet his hunger remains unsatisfied because the real nourishment lies inside, not outside. This is why women throughout history have been called mysterious, dangerous, enchanting. They are not dangerous in themselves. They are dangerous because they awaken in men the power and terror of the feminine within. The queen who withdraws is not cruel. She is a threshold guardian. She says without words, "Enter your own labyrinth or remain forever enslaved to longing." And you listening now must ask, what happens when he chooses not to enter? What happens when he clings instead, demanding the queen return so he can silence the inner call? Then you will see obsession turn to resentment, desire curdle into bitterness, worship transform into hatred. He will accuse the queen of cruelty, of manipulation, of being the source of his torment. Yet it was never her. It was always the mirror. He cannot destroy the reflection, so he tries to shatter the mirror itself. This is the tragedy of men who never face the anima. They turn against the women who reveal her. But there is another path, and some, though few, find the courage to take it. They stop chasing, stop blaming, and in the silence left behind, they finally listen. They feel the hunger not as need for her, but as longing for themselves. They meet the anima, trembling, fragile, radiant. They realize the queen outside was never meant to save them. She was meant to remind them. And when they reclaim the anima, something astonishing happens. They rise. They look at the queen not as savior, not as tormentor, but as equal. Their shadow becomes ally instead of enemy. Their silence transforms from emptiness into depth. Yet the question remains unresolved. What does the queen herself gain from this dance of shadow and silence? If the man's descent is initiation, what is the initiation of the woman who withdraws? For every archetypal pattern runs in two directions. If his shadow awakens, what awakens in her when she steps back into her throne? When a queen withdraws, it is not only a reaction to his blindness, but also the secret initiation of her own sovereignty. For too long, she may have carried the weight of being mirror, healer, mother, and muse. She gave him a reflection so he would not collapse, a tenderness so he would not drown, a presence so he would not forget himself. But slowly, she began to sense the cost. Her essence was being consumed in the endless project of sustaining another's wholeness. Silence then becomes her rebellion, her reclamation, her ritual of return. By refusing to speak, she speaks the loudest truth. I am not here to complete you. This withdrawal does not arise from cruelty but from necessity. It is the moment the queen steps back into her throne and feels the cold weight of her crown again. It is heavy because it demands she endure his storm without rushing to calm it. It is heavy because it requires her to resist the temptation of becoming savior, even when her compassion aches to soothe. Yet this is where her true initiation lies. If he must descend into his underworld, she must ascend into her sky. She must learn to breathe above the clouds of his chaos, to stand as mountain rather than river, to embody the untouchable stillness that does not yield to the winds of desperation. For the woman, this withdrawal becomes an initiation into the archetype of the high priestess or the silent oracle. She knows without speaking, she sees without declaring. Her silence becomes sacred space, a temple where only those who are whole may enter. Many men rage at that temple gate, furious that they cannot force entry, but the queen does not open the door for rage. She waits. She tests not by questions, but by silence. And in that silence, she protects her own flame, ensuring it will not be extinguished by the winds of his unintegrated shadow. Yet the silence is not easy. Within her, too, the inner child stirs, the little girl who once believed love meant overgiving, over-explaining, over-healing. That girl whispers, maybe if I just say one more word, he will understand. Maybe if I make myself softer, he will return in peace. But the queen knows this is the trap. To give in is to betray herself. So she holds the silence like a sword, sharp yet invisible, cutting away the illusions of codependency. Her silence does not punish him. It protects her from collapsing into the old cycle, where she becomes the mother of a man who refuses to grow. This initiation into sovereignty is not merely psychological, it is mythic. In Greek lore, Persephone's silence beneath the earth gave her power as queen of the underworld. In Egyptian myth, Isis wept in hidden chambers, her grief shaping gods and kings. In Jung's vision, the feminine mystery is not in her words but in her depths. The queen withdraws into those depths not to abandon the man, but to commune with herself, to remember that she is more than a reflection of his anima. She is a whole cosmos, untamed and vast. To stand in that truth, she must endure the loneliness of silence, the ache of not being understood, the accusations of being distant or cold. But this ache is the birth canal of sovereignty. For you listening now, the lesson is piercing. If you are the queen who withdraws, your silence must not be empty avoidance but sacred refusal. Refusal to play savior, refusal to shrink, refusal to confuse love with sacrifice. It is an act of alchemy. You transform your silence into a throne, your distance into a mirror that cannot be ignored. And if he rages, let him rage. If he obsesses, let him obsess. These are not yours to carry. You are not responsible for another's shadow. You are responsible only for the flame you protect in the temple of your being. But here lies the paradox. While you withdraw to protect your sovereignty, your silence also ignites something in him that may awaken his. This is why the queen's power is often feared, even demonized. She does not control through seduction or words, but through absence. Absence is the most potent presence, for it forces the other to confront the void within themselves. And yet, this power cuts both ways. For if she clings to silence too long, if she withdraws without love, she may calcify into the ice queen, untouchable, unreachable, trapped in the fortress of her own detachment. The same silence that heals can also wound if it becomes armor rather than initiation. So the queen must also walk her own razor's edge. She must ask, am I withdrawing to punish or to preserve? Am I silent out of fear or out of faith in my own worth? If her silence emerges from bitterness, it hardens her heart. If it emerges from sovereignty, it liberates both her and him. This is why the archetype is so demanding. It forces her into self-honesty more brutal than any confrontation with another. Her throne is not gifted. It is earned in the fire of her own restraint. And yet beneath this struggle, something deeper is stirring. If the man is called into descent and the woman is cow, into withdrawal, are they truly separate journeys? Or are these two halves of the same myth, circling one another like moon and sun, shadow and flame? For if he faces the anima within and she embodies the oracle without, what is born in the space between them? When silence stretches long enough, it ceases to be only an absence. It becomes a mirror, and in that mirror the man sees not the queen herself but the unhealed landscape of his own soul. The shadow rises, restless and dark, whispering of abandonment, betrayal, and primal fear. He remembers the little boy who once cried for a mother's gaze, the youth who once ached for affirmation, the man who never truly learned how to sit with emptiness. Her silence summons them all. In the absence of her voice, his inner ghosts scream louder, demanding to be heard. And so, paradoxically, the queen's withdrawal becomes the only path that can awaken his shadow to the surface. At first, he may resist. He may throw himself into distractions, drown his unease in noise, pursue other women as substitutes, or armor himself with pride. Yet none of these dissolve the haunting weight of the queen's silence. Instead, each attempt to escape only makes the absence sharper. Her stillness becomes like the crack in a mirror, at first small, then spreading across every reflection he sees. No matter where he looks, he cannot avoid the fracture. This is the power of the archetype. The woman who withdraws forces the man to confront not her, but himself. And in that confrontation, terror lurks. Jung once wrote that the shadow contains everything we refuse to admit about ourselves. For a man obsessed with control, silence reveals his helplessness. For one who hides behind charm, silence exposes his neediness. For one who fears rejection, silence feels like annihilation. The queen, by stepping back, awakens his deepest trial. It is not her cruelty but his own shadow that tortures him. Yet herein lies the paradox. The very torment he despises is also the crucible that could make him whole. If he dares to sit with the void instead of fleeing it, something extraordinary stirs beneath the ashes. Silence then becomes a gate, On one side lies the boy, still clutching for a mother's hand. On the other, the man, grounded in his own sovereignty. To pass through, he must descend into the underworld of himself, to face the forgotten cries, the shame, the hunger for validation. Without this descent, he remains half-formed, forever dependent on a woman's light to keep his darkness at bay. With it, he emerges scarred but sovereign, no longer chasing a queen to fill him but standing as king beside her. Yet this is where most falter. The underworld is merciless, and not every man survives its trial. Some drown in bitterness, blaming the queen for the ache they refuse to own. Others seek softer women who will mother them endlessly, mistaking comfort for love. Still others build walls so high that no silence can touch them again, cutting themselves off not only from pain but also from intimacy. The queen's silence, therefore, is a double-edged sword. It can awaken greatness or it can expose weakness. It is never neutral. It always reveals. For you who listens now, this truth is piercing. If you embody the queen's withdrawal, know that his reaction is not your responsibility. Whether he rises or crumbles is not determined by your return but by his willingness to face himself. Your silence may break him, but if it does, it is because he was unwilling to be broken open. You are not the wound, only the mirror that reflects it. And if you are the man caught in obsession, the lesson is equally unforgiving. No woman's silence is the enemy. It is your own shadow knocking at your door, begging to be seen. The mythic thread returns here, for even in ancient stories, silence and absence were initiations. Orpheus lost Eurydice because he could not resist looking back, unable to endure the void of not knowing. Odysseus was tested by the siren's silence, binding himself to the mast to resist what would consume him. Silence has always been the trial of men. It strips away the illusions of control, forcing them into nakedness before their own soul. The queen who withdraws steps into this ancient current, whether she knows it or not. She becomes oracle, test, and threshold. But every oracle carries a secret. The queen's silence is not meant to destroy but to transform. She does not withhold because she is empty. She withholds because she is full. Full of her own knowing, her own rhythm, her own sacred fire that will not be diluted. The question is never whether he can survive her silence. The question is whether he can endure himself in her absence long enough to discover the king within. And still, a deeper riddle lingers. If his descent is necessary and her withdrawal is necessary, what happens when their paths finally converge again? When he has faced the underworld and she has guarded her temple, do they meet as equals, or do they remain divided by the chasm that silence carved? Does the queen's withdrawal forever change the bond, or can it become the very ground upon which true union is built? When the queen withdraws, the man's descent into silence becomes more than torment. It becomes initiation. Alone with his shadow, he begins to recognize patterns he once denied. He sees how often he sought validation through conquest, how many times he mistook attention for love, how deeply his identity was woven into being desired. The absence forces him to unravel these illusions. At first, this unraveling feels like death, for the ego resists being stripped of its costumes. But death, in the symbolic sense, is always the prelude to rebirth. The ancient myths whispered of this passage. Inanna descended into the underworld and was forced to remove every garment at each gate until she stood naked before the Queen of Death. So too must the man be stripped of his masks. Pride, charm, power, even his carefully crafted masculinity, all fall away under the weight of the queen's silence. And when there is nothing left to cling to, he confronts the raw truth of his own hunger. Not for her body, not for her voice, but for the wholeness he abandoned long ago. Only here can he begin to understand that what he chased in her was always an echo of himself. If he dares to endure this exposure, something shifts. Instead of fearing the void, he learns to breathe within it. Instead of craving constant reassurance, he begins to rest in self-sufficiency. Instead of projecting his anima onto the queen, casting her as savior, temptress, or destroyer, he reclaims the inner feminine that gives him depth and soul. This is individuation, the sacred marriage of opposites within, the birth of a man who no longer begs for wholeness outside himself but carries it inside. And yet, transformation never comes without scars. The man who returns from the underworld does not look like the one who entered. His eyes hold a gravity that others notice but cannot explain. His desires shift. The superficial thrills lose their pull. He becomes magnetic not because he seeks to impress, but because he no longer needs to. A man at peace with his own shadow radiates an authority that silence itself cannot shatter. And here the paradox crystallizes. The queen's silence, which once drove him into madness, now becomes the very soil of his sovereignty. But the story does not end with him alone. Silence carves a path not just for his transformation but for their potential reunion. When he emerges as king, he does not chase the queen to fill a void. Instead, he stands at the threshold with presence, not desperation. The question then arises, does the queen open her gates once more? Her silence was never punishment, it was boundary. She withdrew to guard her sacred energy, to protect her temple from being consumed by a man unready for its fire. But if he returns changed, the silence no longer serves as a wall. It becomes a bridge. This meeting, however, is perilous. For just as silence can awaken a man's shadow, reunion can reignite old patterns if he has not truly integrated. If he approaches her with the same hunger disguised as strength, the bond will crumble again. If he sees her only as the prize of his transformation, he has missed the lesson. The true test lies in whether he can meet her as equal, two sovereigns, neither clinging nor submitting but choosing freely. Only then does silence evolve from trial into communion. And what of the queen? In her withdrawal, she too is transformed. She learns that her power does not depend on being seen or adored. Her silence teaches her that absence can be more magnetic than presence, that mystery can ignite more than constant giving. She remembers that her role is not to rescue, not to mother, not to explain. Her role is to embody, to stand in her truth without compromise. And when she chooses to speak again, her words carry the weight of prophecy, for they emerge not from need but from sovereignty. Together, if they meet after silence, the union is no longer built on projection. It becomes alchemy. He no longer asks her to complete him. She no longer lowers herself to be understood. Instead, their bond becomes a dance of equals, each whole in themselves, each respecting the other's shadow. This is the rarest form of love, for it is not born from lack but from abundance. It is the love Jung hinted at when he spoke of individuation, the union of two souls that have faced their own darkness and emerged whole. Yet the prophecy remains unresolved. The red thread that has woven through the story, the cracked mirror of absence, still waits for its resolution. Will he dare to face himself fully so that the fracture becomes a seam of gold? Will she trust that silence has forged him into something worthy of her temple? Or will the mirror shatter completely, scattering both into separate worlds, never to converge again? The mirror cries but does not break. Its fracture becomes a symbol, an omen hanging between them. For him, every shard reflects a different face: lover, child, hero, fool. For her, each line in the glass whispers of choices: to remain untouchable, to risk opening, or to turn away entirely. The silence has etched its prophecy, and now both stand before it, uncertain whether it will reveal reunion or ruin. The man who has walked through shadow feels the temptation to rush. His old self, the one still hungry for certainty, urges him to seize her, to speak, to demand resolution. But another voice, quieter and older, tells him that haste will undo everything. The silence has taught him patience, and so he waits. His waiting is no longer weakness, it is power. He stands still, and in that stillness he becomes immovable, a mountain rather than a storm. The queen watches. Her eyes, trained by absence, see what they could not before. She remembers the man who once begged for her attention, who drowned her with questions, who turned her silence into a battlefield. But now she sees the stillness in him, the absence of need. And it unsettles her, for it shifts the gravity between them. Where once she was the untouchable one, now he too has learned detachment. The game has changed, and she wonders whether to risk entering it again. Silence deepens between them, but this time it does not cut. It carves, it shapes. It becomes a vessel holding both their shadows without collapsing under the weight. For him, the silence no longer feels like exile, it feels like initiation. For her, silence no longer feels like sacrifice, it feels like sovereignty. What once was torment has become language, a way of speaking beyond words. But no transformation is complete without fire. A moment will always come when silence can no longer hold everything, when the choice must be spoken into existence. Perhaps it begins with a glance, perhaps with a single word, perhaps with nothing more than breath shared in the same room. The queen, who once withdrew to protect her essence, now senses the possibility of revealing again, but only if the man can meet her as equal, not supplicant. This is the razor's edge. One wrong step and the silence becomes prison again. Jung spoke of individuation as the union of opposites, but union is never safe. It requires surrender, not of power but of illusion. The man must surrender the belief that she is his salvation. The queen must surrender the belief that detachment alone guarantees freedom. Each must risk vulnerability, and vulnerability always feels like madness. Yet without that madness, there is no awakening. The cracked mirror returns in their minds. He sees his reflection fragmented, no longer a single face but a chorus of selves. She sees her reflection doubled, one face turned toward sovereignty, the other toward intimacy. The choice lies in whether they dare to step into the mirror and let its fracture become fusion. The crack is not a wound, it is the seam where two worlds might meet. The air between them thickens. The man, now king, does not reach forward. He knows that true power lies not in grasping but in presence. The queen, sovereign in her silence, does not retreat. She knows that true strength is not in withdrawal but in choice. Between them lies the threshold, and the silence hums like a living thing. What emerges from it will shape not only their bond but their destinies. And still the question remains, burning like a coal in the shadows. Will silence become their ending or their beginning? Will the mirror hold, or will it shatter under the weight of their gaze? The answer waits in the next movement, a revelation not yet spoken, a prophecy not yet fulfilled. The night bends toward silence, but it is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of ripening, of something unspoken gathering strength. The queen stands at the threshold, her presence cloaked in mystery. The man who once trembled in her absence now breathes steadily, no longer prisoner to longing. Two sovereigns face one another, their shadows circling like animals in the dark. He remembers the ache of her withdrawal, how it hollowed him out, forcing him to stare into places he had buried for years. That wound, once unbearable, has now hardened into wisdom. He no longer seeks to bind her to him, for he has bound himself to his own center. The dependency that once poisoned his love has been burned away, leaving only essence. The queen feels this shift, and her heart stirs in ways she did not expect. She had feared that her silence would destroy him, that the withdrawal would swallow him whole. Yet instead, it became the crucible that forged him anew. And now she must confront her own mirror. For if he has grown into sovereignty, will she dare to meet him without armor? The choice terrifies her more than solitude, for intimacy with an equal demands more courage than distance ever did. The cracked mirror stands between them, glowing, faintly in the imagination of their shared unconscious. Its fracture no longer looks like ruin, it looks like a path. But walking it will mean stepping into danger, for union is always a risk. Jung warned that individuation is not comfort, it is confrontation with the deepest forces of the psyche. To join hands across the silence is to face those forces not as enemies, but as allies. The man, now king in his own right, waits without pressure. He does not chase, he does not retreat. His power is not dominance but presence, and in that presence the queen feels something ancient awakening. It is the recognition that what she withheld was not only torment to him, but a mirror of her own fear of surrender. Her sovereignty had become a fortress, yet every fortress hungers for a gate. She takes a breath. The air seems to shiver, as if the world itself leans closer to hear what she will choose. She could vanish again, retreat into silence forever, and she would remain untouchable, alone but unbroken. Or she could step forward, not as supplicant nor as rescuer, but as queen to king, meeting shadow with shadow, power with power. The choice does not promise safety, but it promises depth. The prophecy of the cracked mirror begins to resolve. For what is a mirror but a surface of reflection? And what is a crack but the possibility of breaking illusion? The fracture between them is not curse but invitation. It is the seam where two complete beings may stand together, no longer needing to consume or complete each other. The silence that once burned now becomes bridge. Their eyes meet, and for a moment the world holds its breath. She sees him not as child, not as slave, not as desperate seeker, but as sovereign man. He sees her not as idol, not as mystery, not as punishment, but as sovereign woman. The mirror does not shatter. It glows, its fracture a line of fire binding their images into one whole greater than either alone. The silence remains, but it is no longer heavy. It is sacred. It is choice. And in that sacred pause, both understand. The queen who withdraws does not only awaken his shadow, she awakens his crown. And the man who endures her silence does not only survive, he discovers his throne. Together, they no longer need words to know the truth. But still, the final question lingers like a heartbeat in the dark. Will they step fully through the cracked mirror, or will they stand forever at its edge? The dawn breaks and the long night of silence dissolves into a sky of pale gold. Yet there are no trumpets, no dramatic collision of bodies, no cinematic embrace. The true culmination happens in the quiet of the soul. The queen stands alone before the cracked mirror, the man no longer in her sight. This is not abandonment, it is completion. For in the stillness she recognizes that the mirror was never his to repair. It was hers. The fracture she once feared was not the scar of his obsession, but the seam of her own divided self. Part of her longed to be worshipped, to hold power through withdrawal. Another part longed to be met, to be vulnerable, to release the mask of untouchable sovereignty. The mirror had cracked because these two selves could not coexist. And now, as the light touches her, she realizes she does not need to choose one over the other. She can be both mystery and openness, both sovereign and woman, both flame and warmth. The man had served as her mirror just as she had served as his. His desperation revealed her shadow. Her silence revealed his. And in the cruel dance of absence, both were forced to see what lay beneath the roles. But the lesson is not that they belong to one another. The lesson is that each belongs first and foremost to themselves. The path of individuation is not a love story, it is a soul story. She touches the mirror and the fracture no longer feels like a wound. It feels like a river, guiding her deeper into her own depths. The queen who withdraws does not do so out of cruelty, nor out of strategy, but out of instinct, the psyche demanding solitude in order to integrate. Silence is not punishment, it is rebirth. And she now sees that when she pulled away, it was not only him she left in darkness. She left herself there too. The only way forward is to return, not to him, but to herself. The man, somewhere unseen, has already claimed his crown. He walks no longer in her shadow, nor she in his. Their paths may cross again, or they may forever remain parallel. But it no longer matters, for the dependency that once bound them has dissolved into freedom. He does not need her silence to define him. She does not need his obsession to affirm her power. Both have stepped beyond projection into sovereignty. And this is the forbidden truth Jung rarely said aloud. The greatest union is not found in another's arms, but in the marriage of your own inner opposites. The queen's silence and her voice, the man's shadow and his light, the anima and the animus reconciled within. When as inner marriage is consummated, the outer world becomes optional. Love becomes choice, not need. Relationship becomes creation, not survival. She turns from the mirror and steps into the day. There is no crown on her head, no throne beneath her feet, yet she has never felt more royal. For sovereignty is not an image. It is not distance or allure or control. Sovereignty is the knowledge that nothing can be taken from you that you have not first abandoned yourself. Sovereignty is the refusal to chase or to cling, the refusal to barter silence for attention or attention for silence. Sovereignty is the quiet power of knowing, I am whole. And as she walks into the horizon, her steps echo with a new rhythm. The silence is still with her, but it no longer burns. It hums like a secret blessing. For she has learned that silence does not enslave, it liberates. It strips away illusion, awakens shadow, reveals essence. The queen who withdraws is not running from love. She is protecting the sanctity of her soul, ensuring that when she does give herself, it is not out of fear, but out of choice. That is the heart of forbidden Jungian psychology. The withdrawal that wounds also heals, the absence that torments also transforms. It is not cruelty, it is alchemy. It is the secret fire that burns away the false, leaving only what is real. So remember this, when a queen withdraws, she does not destroy, she awakens. And the woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses. Share the moment you felt most empowered in the comments below.